Hello and welcome to the JackCast, the Swansea City podcast. I am Guto and with me, as usual, we have Steve Carroll. Steve, you all right?
Yep, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Not bad. Obviously, we are not breaking social isolation, whatever you call it, rules. We are doing this over Skype in case anybody wants to rat us out to the police. We have once again come together to interfere with the footballing hiatus to bring you a bit of nostalgia, looking back at Swansea seasons gone by. Last time round, we discussed the reign of John Hollins, one of the most affectionately remembered Swansea City managers of our time, certainly. But now we are going on to one of the darkest periods in the club's history. There will not be an outrageous amount of positivity in this podcast. We are going to discuss a lot of off-field troubles as well as on-field difficulties as we move on to the post-Hollins era and the battle to save the club and then keep it in the Football League. Steve, last week we discussed how John Hollins' era obviously after relegation, it continued on a less than positive path. And when Hollins was sacked, it's fair to say that on the pitch, at least, things didn't really turn around massively.
No, they didn't, as you say. We'd had a mixed start to the season, really, in terms of results, but things did really get worse, didn't they? And obviously, I know the ownership is sort of the main thing that will get discussed, I'm sure, because it does sort of override everything that happened that year, didn't it? I suppose when everyone looks back at that season, it's probably known as the petty season, isn't it? Because obviously one man who would become pretty infamous in these parts, shall we say?
Yeah, that's the point, really, isn't it? It's not a season that most people remember for the football, which is probably a good thing because the football was pretty dire for most of that season. But there's no point beating around the bush. Let's get to the defining issue of that season, and it was the ownership. It changed several times in that season, starting off, of course, with Mike Lewis, who was desperate to sell the club. And very early on in that season, he managed to eventually find somebody who was willing to take it off his hands. And they took it off his hands for the tiny price of £1.
Yes, £1. I suppose alarm bells are always ringing, aren't they, when a deal such as that goes through for £1, because you're immediately thinking that it's gone through at that price because there must be big debts and that this person is going to take them on. So obviously me and you were quite young at the time, weren't we? I mean, I was 13 years old when Tony Petty took over, but I know that summer before was when the Supporters Trust first formed, and they'd done some digging on this guy. Obviously thought to be Australian, but in reality was an Australian-based Cockney. He'd been involved with the Brisbane Lions, I think, in Australia, and his past was a little bit shady, to say the least. So I think when he took the helm, immediately a certain amount of the fan base were quite sceptical over what he was going to be like, and obviously it became quite infamous, didn't it? Where I think on a mid-October day, loads of the squad were called in one by one. A number of them were sacked. A number were told they'd have to accept lower contracts and stuff like that, really. And yeah, it all just appeared to be pretty grim, didn't it? I mean, you're looking at that situation, then you're thinking, well, obviously the existence of the club really was on the line, wasn't it?
Yeah, he came in, and the first thing he did really was get rid of large swathes of players who were, of course, contracted to the club. I mean, breaking all sorts of employment laws in the process, but I mean, instantly you have alarm bells ringing then when that kind of thing goes on. Add that with his questionable business record prior to joining the Swans. I mean, there were quite a lot of, he'd left a trail of destruction behind him, really, of failed companies and bankruptcies, etc. If anybody who was not instantly worried when he bought the club for £1, very quickly realised that this was not the kind of character that you really want running your club. Now, he will have argued that what he was doing was necessary because there were all these debts and because the club was tanking money and that it was in a bad way and needed to be brought onto the straight and narrow. But the thing with Petty was the way he went about his business. He was not a man who he did not really do his best to make friends with people. He went about his work in a very spiteful way, in what seemed like a very kind of cruel and calculated way, which is what really sets him apart from a lot of owners. Football's history is littered with dodgy owners, people who should not be involved in the game, people whose motives are questionable. But often those people kind of try to hide behind a degree of charm and personality and try to kind of spin the way out of things and put on this front for people to try and keep people on side. And Petty was never like that. That he was like a bull in a china shop. He came in with the intention of just getting rid of all the assets. He came in with no intention of really making friends. He was here to make enemies from the start, and that's exactly what he did, Steve.
Yeah, it did seem like that, didn't it? I mean, I know if a business is hemorrhaging money, obviously you do have to make cutbacks. I mean, there's no two ways about that. But at the same time, football's not really like other businesses, is it? Because, I mean, if you get rid of all your top earners, who are the players, it'll take you down, and then you'll be in an even worse position financially because you get less money through the gate, and then you get less TV money, etc. So it's like a bit of a vicious circle then, isn't it? So it's, it is difficult. But I mean, just like I said, the way you went about things, I mean, doing that is obviously bad enough, as we all know. But then he was on the first, as soon as that was done, he was on in the car to Heathrow and on a flight back to Australia. Basically, he left everybody else to then deal with the consequences, which just shows you that the type of man really that he was, didn't it? Just dark days, really. I mean, with the whole thing, didn't it? But it did sort of galvanise us, didn't it? I mean, I don't know if you remember the Petty out marches or if you were on them as such, but they're quite vivid memories for me, really. I remember we played Brighton, I think, in the LDV vans, as it was probably called then. I mean, it's a bit of a nothing game really early in the competition, but I remember it must have been a good few hundred gathering in Castle Square to march down towards the Vetch, and then I think there was another one then a few days later when we played Leyton Orient, because remember they had a banner that said Petty out, so I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Leyton Orient, but I think it did sort of galvanise the fan base as well, didn't it? Because there was an attitude then of, we've got to get rid of this man and we've got to get the club into the right shape and into the right hands, because we've been stuck with poor ownership probably over a prolonged period, haven't we?
Well, let's face it, over Swansea's entire history, we've probably had more bad owners than good, if we're being perfectly honest about it. We've had our fair share of dodgy characters. I mean, what strikes me, just preparing for this pod, I look back, Tony Petty was owner of Swansea City Football Club for around 16 weeks. That's all he was here for. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable when, these days you see owners, really unpopular owners, just stick it out and they say, no, we're not going to go anywhere. I can't remember what that guy's name was at Bury, but he was, adamant that he was going to hold on to his club no matter what and didn't go anywhere. I mean, it felt like much longer than 16 weeks, but it is ridiculous how quickly it went from him buying the club to a massive protest movement being organised against him. Very highly organised protest movement as well, which is what undoes a lot of clubs, is the fact that they can't really get this kind of united front together with fans and get everybody singing from the same hymn sheet. That happened with the Swans. And then, a heck of a lot happened in those 6 weeks, but it culminated with him actually being forced out. It's mad, actually, looking back, that fans were able to mobilise in a way that did actually manage to get him out of the club and get a takeover over the line in such a short space of time.
Well, I think that we did discuss it briefly off air. I mean, there was a bit of a, should we say, a bit of a naughtier side to the Swans fan base probably in those days, which in some ways I think is not necessarily a bad thing in those situations, because there was, I think, rather than sometimes you need action. And I think an example would be the Rushden and Diamonds game where Petty infamously turned up in the director's box. I remember the North Bank playing havoc about it. And then at the end, there was a pitch invasion. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily is the right thing to do, but at the same time, it is action. It does make the press, and it did probably add a little bit of maybe intimidation towards him, which, again, that may have swayed his thinking to think maybe I picked the wrong club here, maybe I need to get out of town. And if that is the case, then obviously you'd have to say it's maybe not a bad thing, as much as it's not maybe the way you ideally want to do things, is it? But like you say, it was because of what he did. It was pretty obvious, really, that he wasn't going to have any friends in town, so to speak, and we had to, get rid of him by however means and however means necessary, really. And there was a certain element of the fan base that would have made sure that it would have happened, I think. But obviously, as you say, 16 weeks, it is mad, really, isn't it? Because it felt like a lot longer, didn't it? And there were good days where we felt we were making progress, and there were probably other days then where, because I remember before the final deal went through, I think there was another consortium interested in buying the club, and then that fell through, and we just didn't know, really. I mean, we just knew we needed to get this guy out of the club, so to speak. And there were various issues further down the line when I remember the players weren't paid at some point, and the PFA had to step in and all stuff like that. So I suppose when you think about it, it did feel like it did go on for the entire season, but that's not actually the case, is it? But it was a very difficult time, really, to be a Swans fan, wasn't it? I mean, I know we've been critical of what's gone on over the last handful of years, should we say, since we've changed ownership, but it's nothing on what we were going through then, is it, if we're being honest?
No, exactly. And anybody who, for all the Americans' faults, there are people who would compare them to Tony Petty. And I mean, when you look back at the way the club was run then, the turmoil that we were in, you can't really compare. There is a huge difference, if we're being honest. I mean, like you said, that it did, the many of the methods that were employed were probably questionable. I mean, at the time, I think it was just a case of do whatever's necessary to get him out. But I was thinking, if a club did that these days, I mean, football, the Swans have definitely changed since then. I mean, these days, I think we like to think ourselves as a bit of a classy club in some ways. We've played good football for a long time. When we were in the Premier League, we were a lot of team fans' second clubs. We were people liked us. I think we were seen as a bit of a nice club. I mean, that wasn't the case back then by any means. You could argue it's not really the case now, but back then, we were a much nastier, grittier club, and you could see that in a lot of the methods that were used. I mean, it did threaten to turn violent quite often. There were threats being made. It was deeply unpleasant throughout. And some of the things that went on, I do wonder, that whether if they happened in the modern day, that the club would have lost quite a lot of sympathy from other football fans if they had seen, people if they'd heard of people making threats and threatening to turn violent, etc. Would people have thought, well, no, this isn't the way to do things? Back then, I guess there was less attention on lower league football. People outside of South Wales would probably not have been keeping a close eye on what was going on at the Vetch. And it just reminds. I mean, we remember a few years ago, West Ham's fans invading the pitch and trying to invade the hospitality boxes to get at the Dildo brothers, the two Davids, in the stands, and they had a lot of criticism, the West Ham fans, for that. And we like to romanticize that period and think, fans came together to force Petty out, but part of me does wonder if the same thing was to happen these days, would we have lost a lot of sympathy from the general public by employing some of the methods, because we went for a hell for leather and we gave it our all, and it was nasty. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, you do wonder. I mean, like you say, it's a different generation now, isn't it? I mean, stuff like social media obviously makes it, a difference in terms of some things. I remember there's a documentary on about 18 months ago, I think, just before the World Cup, and they were talking about England managers, and remember Henry Winter was on there, and he said about obviously when Glenn Hoddle got removed from the England job for the remarks that he'd made, and I remember Henry Winter saying that he felt if it was today, he wouldn't have lasted an hour after those remarks had been made public, such as the pressure that's on. And it's just a different world these days, isn't it? For everybody. I mean, it's difficult to tell. What I think, because you were saying there about the lower leagues. Really, I think the lower leagues are still largely ignored in general. And I do also think, though, that if there's a case of where your existence is under threat, then I think if people do maybe cross the line slightly, you won't get so much stick. I mean, you look at Bury, they've lost their club now, haven't they? And I bet they wish maybe they'd done things maybe a little bit of sympathy for them, by the way. I'm not saying that their fan base could have even made a difference, but it's difficult, isn't it? And as you say, I mean, the West Ham case, it is completely different, isn't it, really? I do understand some of the fans' frustrations, but it's not like the club's existence is under threat. Like you said, they took a lot of stick for what went on. It was probably a little bit over the top, wasn't it? With a lot of it. But like I say, it is a different world that we're in these days, isn't it? And I think a lot of if you look at our fan base, I mean, we'll probably talk about it later in terms of, I know a lot have been unhappy about this regime, both of us included, really. I mean, I was involved in some protest stuff. Then there's a lot of other people that just maybe not interested in, just as long as we're winning, we'll basically do nothing and then just not bothered. And I think that's just the way that the world that we live in. Whereas I think that maybe the older school football fan that maybe was going in, the lower league days, probably for a lot of clubs this is the same as well, where they're not willing to put up with certain things, and maybe those type of people, there's not as many of them about these days. So it just means that it's like a different type of fan that is going to games.
It's actually interesting. Do you think perhaps things would have been a little bit more toned down had the Swans been playing a little bit better at the time? Because we were pretty awful that season. Had we been challenging for promotion, would things have been a little bit quieter? Would they have been accepted? I mean, obviously we would never have been challenging for promotion with the owner sacking players left, right, and centre. But hypothetically speaking, because one of the things about Bury was that actually over the last few years they've been doing pretty well on the pitch. They're pushing for promotion for a long time, getting promoted to League One, and even though they were throughout that period, racking up debt, getting into financial difficulty, it didn't seem like anybody was, too bothered about the running of the club, because they were actually doing quite well on the pitch. Do you think perhaps there could have been an element of that with the Swans?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's very difficult to say, isn't it? And I do think down here in general we are just a bit sceptical of people in general, like maybe because of what's happened in the past. But it's it is difficult to say, isn't it? Like I said, I think certainly in today's world it is very much like if you are winning, it does mask a lot of problems. Because I mean, I said when we picked up under Carvalhal, it's like, yeah, we might be winning here, but there's still long-term issues here that need sorted. A couple of good wins here and there are not going to make them go away, and so it's proved, really. So I think it's a short-sighted thing, really, isn't it, to look, we're winning at the moment, don't rock the boat. Well, yeah, okay, fair enough, within reason, but at the same time, if there's going to be big problems further down the line, they are going to have to be addressed at some point. So, it's difficult, but I mean, I think certainly the more modern fan is more bothered about winning than anything else, whereas I think maybe down the Vetch it wasn't like that. So it's difficult to say. It would be interesting to see really how many people that were regulars down the Vetch are still with us and still going in some ways, because they're the type of people that could really answer the question, couldn't they? I mean, and you'll never get a definitive answer, but you'll always get since the stadium moved, for example, I mean, you'll get more women and children going in, which is great, and obviously it's understandable. I mean, you could have running jokes all day, couldn't you, about the Vetch for the toilets, and I mean, they were terrible when we can't dress it up any other way. It does make me laugh when they get mentioned, but you can't expect many women to have gone down there, can you? Because they were so bad. So the fact that then when you have a new ground, that's always makes it more appealing. It's the same for kids, isn't it? So you'll always get those the different type of fan, and obviously hospitality at the Vetch was probably more or less non-existent, wasn't it? And now you get that when you move to a new ground. So
put it this way, my dad didn't take me to the Vetch until I was 9 years old. We took my younger sister, to the Liberty when she was 4 years old, because it was just, I don't think we would have taken her to the Vetch at 4 years old. Maybe younger than 9, but we wouldn't have taken her at 4 years old probably. The atmosphere just changed instantly. You can't help it when you change from a beautifully grotty ground like the Vetch to a state-of-the-art all-seater stadium like the Liberty. And that stadium change, I mean, we'll get onto this in future podcasts, definitely, but it did change the fan base. There's no doubt about that. And even people who had been going to the Vetch for years changed the way they did things in many cases, and
you're right. I mean, one example I've gone through off the top of my head is I know a lot of people down the Vetch, especially on the North Bank, wouldn't have a season ticket, partly because maybe they work shifts or something like that, so they didn't always go. Or maybe if you played senior league or something like that, it might be a case of, well, if you're playing, I don't know, Ashley Road, you could probably make the Vetch, but if you're playing down South Gower, for example, you can't. So then they wouldn't be tied into it. But then when you're at the stadium and you have to have a seat and you've got to be next to the same people every week, you can't go and stand by your mates if you go in last minute. Then sort of forces you then, doesn't it, into getting a season ticket, for example. So that's a big change, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. The terrace to stand makes you make that kind of decision, But look, going back to the petty, the petty era, if you can call 16 weeks an era. I mean, we got to December, and like you said, players weren't paid. And you look at any club these days, and as soon as players don't get paid, then alarm bells start ringing. You think, hang on, there's something quite seriously wrong going on here. And that was certainly the case at Swansea. And it wasn't long after that Petty was eventually it decided to finally cooperate with those who looking to buy the club. He says that in a Jack to King that it was a match against Macclesfield in the second round of the FA Cup that made his mind up that he wanted to sell, because he had been hoping that we'd get through to the third round and get a money spinning tie which would buy him some time. It didn't happen, and he realised that the writing was on the wall, and if he was to make money out of this club, he needed to sell. And, he put up a hell of a fight. He did not want to sell it to the consortium that eventually bought it, but eventually a group of businessmen clubbed together and managed to wrestle the club off of him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it did take quite a while, didn't it? And, it's to be fair. I mean, I'm sure we'll get on to the people who did buy the club. I mean, and I suppose what their legacy will be and stuff like that. But yeah, I think to buy from a man like him was always going to be difficult. I think he was always going to be awkward about it and probably try and get as much as he could for it. So it was whoever was going to buy it. I think it was always going to be difficult and take a little bit of time. But like you say, in the end, the deal was done, and he disappeared to never be seen again until Jack came. I was actually amazed they even got hold of him for that, to be honest with you. But yeah, it was it was a deal that had to be done, wasn't it? From our point of view, I mean, this guy had to go, and the club had to go into better hands, should we say? And we were lucky, really, that a group of mainly local businessmen, obviously one or two other ones as well. In all fairness, they put their money where their mouths were, didn't they? And obviously, a lot of us didn't have money to put into it, and it should never really be forgotten, in spite of what has gone on, in more recent years. That without these guys, we may not have a club. So, I think, in spite of all the criticism that maybe I have given them, I will admit, they must get credit for that as well, because that was very, very important for the future of this club, to even have a club, really. That Mr. Petty was no more.
Yeah, he disappeared then. Once the club was eventually sold, he made quite a bit of money off of the club, considering he bought it for just £1 and managed to sell it on for several £1,000s. And of course, the club had new owners, but there was a sense of celebration. The Petty had gone, thinking, okay, great, there are better times ahead now. But I mean, there was still, of course, and of course, not long after that, much of the club's debt was wiped off as well, which made a huge difference to the club's ability really to just regenerate and move on from the chaos that had preceded him. But moving back onto the pitch, any improvement off the pitch did not improve our fortunes in the league table, Steve.
No, it didn't. I mean, we should probably go on and discuss briefly, some of the games that, there were during that period. I know there weren't that many memorable ones. Were there? But before we came on there, we did discuss, didn't we, the QPR game in the FA Cup, and that was probably it has to be considered the highlight of the season, because QPR were a division above us, weren't they? Their assistant manager was a certain Kenny Jackett, who little did we know would be taken over a few years later. But obviously we knocked a side in a division above us out of the cup 4-0. So you've got to say that is a pretty good achievement. And the main memory I got of that night was that big Mamadi Sidibe ran the opposition ragged, didn't he?
He did. He was one of 4 goal scorers on that day. And yeah, in a you don't think of the Swans. The Swans don't really have a great FA Cup record. Certainly didn't, traditionally. But that was one result which stood out in an otherwise bleak season, really. And yeah, I mean, it's remarkable actually when you look back that that result actually happened, but it did, and of course that was as good as that FA Cup run did get. We did go out in the next round, but it was a nice memory in a season where, let's face it, there weren't that many wins, if we're being honest.
No, there weren't. I mean, I did a few away games that season. I remember I actually did see us win at Kidderminster, so that was a decent win. But I remember Nathan Tyson got sent off, and I don't know if you remember his loan spell with us. I think he scored a couple.
Yeah. It was good.
Bit of a shame we couldn't keep him, actually, because obviously he did go on to have quite a good career. I think he played against us a few times for the likes of Forest, and then I think he was at Derby after that. So, that was one memory I've got. But then we were never really in danger of relegation. We were quite lucky in that sense, because Halifax was shocking, is the basic truth. Although in Colin Addison's first game in charge, they did beat us at the Vetch in a pretty abysmal game from what I remember. But there were some reasonable moments. I think, much as obviously we didn't have a great campaign, but we did have a nice little spell February time where we had 4 wins in 6 and the other 2 were draws. So that was a good spell. And I remember then thinking, well, Addison was out the contract in the summer, was probably deserving of a new deal. He'd been through a lot with us, but I know it had not been a great season, but given what had gone on, we'd sold Stuart Roberts and Matthew Bowden as 2 players we haven't discussed really. Because, I mean, obviously, Roberts, I would say, going forward, especially, was by far our best player. So to lose him, especially for a pittance of 100 grand, was a bit of a tough one to take, really.
But never felt his potential, really, once he left the Swans as well. One of those players who left and never really managed to meet expectations.
Yeah, I think there is a frustration with Stuart Roberts. Like, I do feel sorry that he never really hit the heights that I thought he could have, because he was a really exciting player. I mean, he had great pace. I've always felt he could chip in with a few goals as well, and he was a crowd favourite. I don't think he ever wanted to leave. Is the honest truth of it? Did he? I think that was the killer. It was bad for everybody, really bad for him because it didn't work, and bad for us because obviously we didn't want him to go. The club didn't want him to go, really, but we just felt like we didn't have any choice. That's what happens when you're in the struggling financially, really. So it is genuinely a shame with Stuart Roberts. I think he still would be well remembered by the fan base even now, and certainly one of the the standout players from that time as well. And to be fair, Matthew Bowden was obviously a member of the team that did win the league. Was here for must have been here for 3 or 4 years, something like that. And he was a loss as well, really. So we did. There were some casualties along the way of that, and it was always going to be difficult. But like I said, then Addison, I think, was a bit unlucky, wasn't he, that he didn't get given, an extra season, I would say, because it was a very trying time to be manager of this football club. And he did a respectable job, I would say. But obviously a new regime came in and they decided they were going to do things differently.
Yes, and that led to a player takeover basically of the first team. The unusual move of promoting your captain and goalkeeper to be managers of the club. It didn't really pay off at the end of that season, though, did it, Steve? We lost 4 of our final 6 games, drawing the other 2. It was an end to the season, which probably set us up really for struggle the following year.
Yeah, I think there's 2 standout games from that end of season period, isn't there? When we took a pasting at Rushden and Diamonds 4-0, then we lost 7-1 at Hartlepool, and the main coincidence of both games was that the goalkeeper was not Roger Freestone, it was Jason Jones, and I think that sort of explains a lot of that, because I think, with the greatest respect to him, he was not up to the challenge. We'd seen it previously when he'd subsidised for Roger when he'd had a couple of injuries, and he just was nowhere near good enough. That was the honest truth, and I think he was responsible certainly for some of those goals in those games, and understandably was released at the end of the season because, like I say, he was nowhere near good enough really. And it was a pretty sorry end to the campaign. I think one of the only shining lights really was Andrew Mumford had come on the scene, and I remember there were a couple of spectacular goals. Some of them were free kicks and the like, and that was really just about it in terms of anything to shout about. It was a depressing end of the season, and it did get worse, didn't it? We can't beat around the bush.
Well, that season we finished 20th, which at that point was our second lowest ever league finish. We had finished absolute bottom of the pile in the Football League back in the 1970s at some point. But apart from that, 2000-2001 was our worst ever league finish, 20th in the bottom tier. But, of course, Cusack got to stay in charge for the following season. He was a bit of a hero after the whole Petty out saga and standing up for the players during that spell. But it's fair to say that he wasn't really cut out for management.
No, and I think since he's admitted himself that he felt he wasn't really cut out for it. I don't think he was even massively keen on doing it. I think it's just that he was asked, and I think he was flattered really by being asked to step up to the big job, and felt like, well, being asked, maybe I should do it. Don't know if you remember, obviously, I think late in that season we played the FAW Cup semi-final, and it was on BBC Wales. I remember Brian Flynn was in the studio, and he was out of work at the time. He'd left Wrexham earlier that year after about 12 years there, and he was asked, would you be interested in the Swansea job? And he did say yes. I remember, yeah, he did, and I remember immediately thinking to myself, this is music to our ears here. We've got a manager who's there's a manager here who wants the job, who's taken a smaller club up from League 2 to League 1. They've been there for years. They've always played good football. I was thinking, this is the dream here. Like, this is probably a better manager than we could hope to get. And I remember just thinking, well, surely they've got to be listening to this now and getting the job done. And I remember they had talks. I remember the sticking point was over Kevin Reeves, that they wanted Cusack to be involved in the coaching staff. And I think Flynn's attitude was, well, look, if I'm manager, I've got to decide who's coming with me. And I think that it broke down over that. And then I think there was another discussion then around possibly having Reeves in and Cusack still being involved in the first team. But unfortunately, it came to nothing. And I think there's no two ways about it. That was a mistake, wasn't it? Because after that, then obviously Cusack did have the job, made a load of signings that we went into the next season with. And obviously, it proved to be pretty disastrous, didn't it?
Yeah, he if we were hoping that summer was going to spark some kind of miraculous change, it did, and we got off to a very poor start. I mean, one win in our first. I mean, God knows how many games. Basically, we won one game between the start of the season and mid-October, getting ourselves very, very deep into a relegation battle. I mean, that forced a managerial change. Of course, Brian Flynn came in. I mean, like you said, I mean, he'd done wonders at Wrexham, absolute wonders. He was a real favourite up there. Had a brilliant track record for finding players out of nowhere. He, played attacking, exciting football. I mean, looking back, we were so lucky to actually get him, weren't we? When we seemed to be on a one-way ticket to non-league, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we were. I mean, I think it was a thing that obviously he's a Port Talbot boy, so I think he's never really come out and said it massively, but I do think he's always obviously had a soft spot for the Swans. And obviously with it being like a Welsh club as well, I think it just seemed like he wanted to have this job, which we were, as you say, very lucky with, really, because I mean, it was a better manager than probably we deserved at that time. And it's a surprise from my point of view, really, with Flynn, that after Wrexham, nobody else had actually taken him, because he'd done very well there. And you would have thought a club in League One would have said, right, well, this guy has done really well on a small budget over a long period of time. So obviously showing he can do the business. Why don't we give him a job? And luckily for us, obviously it didn't happen. So he's come in here, and obviously there were vast changes really after that, weren't there? I mean, as you say, it started badly under Cusack. I do remember we played Rushden and Diamonds in the opening day. I don't know if you remember that too well, but I do remember with that game, the ref playing a lot of injury time where he shouldn't have, and then they equalised right at the end. And I think that sort of set us off on a bad start, really. I remember I went to Bury, actually, in one of the early away games, and we were really poor. We did really scrape a draw. But then I think what probably did it for Cusack was that we lost 4-0 at Wrexham, and that actually came off the back of where we'd lost 3-2 to Wolves in a League Cup game, where we'd actually played really well on that game, and we'd given them a good game. We were unlucky to not get extra time, really, but like I said, we lost 4-0 at Wrexham, but I remember we were 3 down in about 15 minutes, so it was like a really bad one. And then we had Boston on the Wednesday night, and they were bottom because they had a -4. Don't know if you remember, they had the points deduction because of some sort of financial thing, didn't they, with the manager, Steve Evans, and they beat us, and then they ended up going above us, and that did put us bottom, didn't it? And that was the first time in our history we'd been bottom of the Football League, so that was a dark day for us, and that was what did for Cusack, really, and Flynn came in, but it did take time, didn't it, to pick up, I suppose because the squad wasn't good enough. I think that was the honest truth of it, really, and we had to rebuild the side, didn't we? And there were a lot of casualties. Remember, obviously, 10 players were brought in by Cusack, and by March there was only one left, James Thomas. So that does say a hell of a lot, really, doesn't it, in terms of the quality of those players? I mean, it did seem a little bit harsh on one or two, maybe, but at the same time, it does show you that our transfer business just wasn't good enough, was it?
No, but the transfer business definitely picked up after that. Some very notable players brought in, including, of course, but Leon Britton and Alan Tate, who are still at the club these days, nearly 20 years on, which is phenomenal. But others, the likes of Brad Maylett, who went on to become a fan's favourite. That transfer activity, I think Martinez as well, obviously, was brought in, who played a big role in turning us around. There were quite a few players there who brought. I mean, we just would not have stayed up without some of those players coming in, would we?
No, there's no two ways about it. I mean, I interviewed Brian Flynn quite a long time ago now for the fanzine. I remember he always cited Martinez as the key signing. He said he was like the last piece of the jigsaw, really, in his view. And he said he always felt that we could stay up. I mean, there were a lot of signings, weren't there? I mean, as you say, I think the first one was actually Brian Cash, a less memorable loan signing. That one wasn't great, but they did pick up from there. I remember Alan Tate came in with Mark Richards, and then shortly after, Leon Britton came in. Like I said, Martinez, Lenny John Rose came in, of course, Kevin Nugent. So they were all, to be fair, all of those guys played a big part for us, didn't they? I mean, because before that, things were dire, weren't they? I mean, I don't know if you were there the night that we lost 4-0 to Kidderminster, but that could be the worst result in our entire history.
That was the ultimate, I think, low point of that season. Probably that was the rock bottom of possibly Swansea's entire history in terms of in terms of our on-field status. Anyway, I mean, I wasn't there that night, but speak to anybody.
I was.
Speak to anybody who, and they did not see a way out of it after that. It was one of those results that you think the writing is on the wall here. It's just too much of an ask for us to for this team to get out of trouble.
Yeah, I think my main memory of the night was like, I think I was quite naive maybe as a youngster, like because we were quite a reasonable team in the bottom tier in terms of gates and stuff like that, and we were usually towards the top. I think I just thought to myself, well, I know we had a bad year with Petty, but I just thought, well, we'll be fine now. That's all out the way. But then I remember obviously we'd started badly, and you always think, oh, it'll pick up, we won't go down. And we lost 4-0 to Kidderminster. So I remember thinking, oh, okay, maybe this is quite serious here. We could be in big trouble. And I think maybe a lot of people thought that. And I remember it did get worse, didn't it? I mean, I remember we beat Shrewsbury at home 2-0 in a late November. And we did play really well that day. And I remember thinking, maybe we've turned the corner here. But then came 6 defeats in a row. And one of them, I remember, was Bristol Rovers on Boxing Day. They were bottom. We were second bottom. And they turned us over. I remember then thinking, God, this is desperate here, losing to, the only side below us. I remember then we lost to Bury. I don't know if you remember this one. We were 3 down at half time and thinking, oh my God. I think the North Bank were chanting, you're not fit to wear the shirt. And you just think this is pretty much rock bottom. We got a goal back in the second half. And then straight from the kickoff, Steve Watkin is 1-on-1. And he's hit it wide. And I think every touch after that got booed. We did get another goal back and we lost 3-2. But it was like that low, if you know what I mean. And I'm just thinking, how is this going to sort of turn around? And I was even thinking about, why is Flynn in danger here? Because it just hasn't picked up, even though the signings have come in.
It didn't look like he was actually having any kind of effect. That's the thing. We think of Flynn as being this kind of like magic wand, and obviously he did eventually, of course, get us, get things clicking and got results together, which saw us safe on the final day, which we'll get to. But it did take a long time, and it did look for a long time like even Flynn wasn't going to be the man to rescue us. It just didn't seem to be clicking, and the malaise just seemed to be ingrained in the team to such an extent that it wasn't going to shift. I mean, we had no way of knowing at that point that the likes of Martinez, Britton, Mailer, Tate, we're going to be able to turn things. We're going to turn into players that would steer us to safety. I mean, it just looked entirely bleak at that point. But I mean, when 2002 came to an end, and in the whole of 2002, by the way, we won 9 games in all competitions, which is
God, I did not even realise it was that bad. That's horrific, isn't it?
In the year 2002, we won 9 games in all competitions. That must be among our worst calendar years ever. But then it was in January that things just began to pick up, and we started just stopping losing. We were not only winning, we were getting draws for the first time in the season, really. And suddenly it just began to turn around.
Yeah, I remember actually it was the signing of Kevin Nugent that sort of sparked us, because I remember we beat Lincoln 2-0. That was to end the 6 defeats in a row. So he'd got a goal, and then I think that was his debut. So that was a big moment. And then the following week, I don't know if you remember, we played Ruston and Diamonds, and it was on Sky, away from home. And we went 1-0 up. They were top. Obviously, we were bottom at this stage. And then we had a second goal ruled out for like a shove, but there was nothing in it whatsoever. I remember the manager afterwards as well admitting there was nothing in it. And they've come back, they've equalised, we've drawn 1-1. It was a good draw, but I remember thinking afterwards, massively hard done by you. We should have had the win. And then we beat Darlington, and we went to Macclesfield and won. That was a big win, because that was our first away win for nearly a year. But obviously then, like I said, we'd had 3 wins in 4, and the other was a draw. So that brought us right back into contention. And then after that, it did feel like we were sort of in the pack, and we had a reasonable chance of getting out of it. Although, of course, the Swansea being Swansea, we were never going to do things the easy way, were we?
No, but it is amazing, isn't it, the difference a psychology can make? Because after that 6-game losing streak that you talked about, we lost 5 games in our remaining 20, which is a huge turnaround. I mean, it is weird how football can be like that. A team can just look like total no-hopers for so long, and then suddenly something just clicks. You find that player that makes things work, and suddenly confidence boosts, and you get on a bit of a roll, and that's definitely what happened, really. And a team that actually looked destined for relegation, starting putting runs together, and it set us up for a nail-biting but exciting final stage to the season.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it is remarkable, as you say. We only lost 5 of the last 20, but there's 2 things I'll take from that. Really, was even though that was the case, it still went to the final day, which sort of shows you how bad we've been previous to that. But the other thing is, I'm looking at some of those defeats. I remember one was Carlisle, and they were around us in the table. We were at home to them, and you're thinking, oh, this is a good chance here to pull clear. But of course, Swansea being Swansea, we end up losing. Although we were unlucky in the sense of, I think, they got a penalty at 0-0 quite late on, and it was heading for a 0-0. I think it was a crap game. But Lee Jenkins has headed the ball off the line, and the refs give an handball, pen, red card, and it's killed us. And I remember then Exeter on Easter Monday was another one. Remember, we were 1 point ahead of them. 4 points ahead of them. So if we win, we go 7 clear of them with two games left. So then you're pretty much safe. And of course, we have to lose and put them 1 behind us. And then that put us under big pressure then, didn't it, going into the last couple. But, I mean, I suppose that's the Swansea we know and love, isn't it? We for some reason, we had to just push it and give us all those horrible sleepless nights.
And it did set up, the final day, which is the ultimate final day in Swansea City's history, in any club's history, really. If there is one date that you look back and think, it could have gone one way or the other. And if it had gone the other way, Lord knows what would have happened to this football club. Who knows if we would still be in existence right now. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of that match against Hull. Everybody has their stories from that game. I'll start off with mine, because my story is I couldn't be there. It was the day of my grandfather's funeral, which meant that we had to miss the game. And my memories of that match are being at home, sat in front of Gillette Soccer Saturday. The whole family sat in front of Gillette Soccer Saturday, desperately waiting to see what the result was going to be. And every single goal, for and against, just being met with the most ridiculous of emotions and response. It was enough of a roller coaster watching it from my living room. No matter how much you watch the footage back again, I cannot imagine what it would have been like being at the Vetch on that day, Steve.
Yeah, it's not a day that I think anyone will ever forget, really, who was there. My usual ritual on a Saturday in those days was we'd get into town about lunchtime. I'd go to Riley's, we'd play pool or something like that, and maybe watch whatever game was on Sky. Usually grab some food and then go to the Vetch. I think it was in there quite early that day. I remember it being like a shocking day weather-wise. The pitch wasn't in the best of states. I remember everyone being, obviously nervous, on edge, really is the way to describe it. One thing I always remember was they played Hen-Blad Vanada just before kick-off, and it was like real like hairs on the back of your neck stuff. Everyone was like massively like pumped for this game, as you can imagine, with it being the stakes being so big. But you could see the almost cut the nervous tension with a knife as well, if you know what I mean, because everyone knew just what the stakes were. But remember, it was a proper like Vetch atmosphere. The place was, full on rocking. But I mean, we all went through so many emotions, I think, in that game. I remember the game like starting. We were on the front foot. We got the penalty early on. I remember a few people trying to get on the pitch when we got the penalty and just thinking we've already had some sort of warning about this, and thinking, well, don't come on the pitch now, because if we get a points deduction, that could kill us even if we do win. So, but James Thomas has buried it. Obviously, it's a big moment, big relief. But then us being us, within a minute, it's 1-1. Lee Jenkins probably should have stuck the ball in the stand. He hasn't done it. And obviously then they scored. Remember the guy that scored, Stuart Elliott, was quite a good player, actually. He was I remember a few times we played against Hull, he was quite useful. And then obviously we've conceded again. Michael Howard's made the mistake this time. I remember the guy scoring and just looking at Howard, and you could see he looked like he wanted the ground to swallow it up. And I remember I didn't speak many words after that until I think we got that second equaliser. There was a real sense of like devastation there. I remember another thing I did that day actually was I'd signed up on my phone to have updates of the Exeter game, because obviously there wasn't internet on phones really in them days, was there? And I didn't want to be in a position where I didn't know what was going on. So I thought, right, I'm going to sign up for this. And I had a message saying penalty save, and I couldn't work out who it was for in the end. It said Kevin Miller, penalty save. But obviously he was the Exeter goalkeeper. So I knew then, it was like, oh, okay, Southend, I think they were playing, had missed the pen. You're thinking, oh,
squandered it.
Yeah, you're thinking, oh, that could have, taken the pressure right off us. But remember another key moment in that game being that Cutler Neil Cutler, that is, obviously he's another player that come in on loan we haven't discussed really. But he made a big save at 2-1 to Hull. And obviously if they'd gone 3-1 up, you do always wonder then, would that have been it? There was a fair chance it probably would have been, if we're being honest. I mean, that would have, it would have been a big ask to come back from that. But thank God he did make that save. And then we've gone up the other end just before half time. Remember that it's a dodgy penalty, isn't it? I think.
I was going to ask, is it a penalty?
I was in the East Stand, so for me, obviously, it's not a great view of the other end. I remember everybody appealing for it, but I think everyone's in that situation. It's just like, I don't care. He's given it. Thank God.
You go in.
Yeah, so he's given it. I remember that. I don't know if I've ever sensed tension like it for that second penalty, because you just felt he has to score this, because if he doesn't, like, the consequences are like that dire. I mean, with the first one, you're like, well, it's 0-0, it's early on. If he misses, it's not great, but at the same time, there's a long way to go. But in this, you're 2-1 down. You're thinking, will we get another chance here? We have to score. And he didn't hit it brilliantly, James Thomas, if we're being honest about it, but the keeper's gone the other way, so it doesn't matter. And it's gone in, and it's 2-2. And then the place is, a bit more upbeat again as we've gone into half time. I mean, it must have. I can't imagine what it was like not being there. Actually, I mean, I would say thank God I was there, because at least you can see what's going on. I mean, I always think it's if you're listening on the radio or watching Soccer Saturday or something, it must be difficult because you don't exactly know what's going on.
Especially back then, because it was a game at the bottom of Division 3, but like it was back then. Even though it was a massive game, they weren't going back to it that often. So you're just waiting, and then they say, "Oh, let's go back to the Vetch," and you're thinking, "Oh, what has and the way Jeff Stelling does his bit, and he's like, "Oh, there's been a goal at the Vetch, but to who?" That kind of thing. It doesn't help when you're extremely nervous. For the record, by the way, no way should that penalty have been given for the second penalty. No way. It's the softest penalty you'll ever see. For once, we had a very sympathetic ref who clearly understood the magnitude of that match and wanted to give us a helping hand. And thank God he did, because we probably needed it at that stage. But it was a major turning point in the game. And the second half, we didn't look back, Steve.
No, we didn't. Obviously, we got that free kick early in the second half on the side. Remember Martinez taking it. It's gone into the box, and it was a bit of a goalmouth scramble, and good old Lenny John Rose has got a foot to it, and it's gone in. I mean, as you can imagine, his delirium. I remember one thing about it was, because it wasn't long after the second half, from where I could see the East Stand, a lot of people on the North Bank must have been out the pint that had missed it. So you could just see them all running back in then and going mad. But yeah, I think when that went in, you're just thinking, well, there's a long way to go here. Are we going to try and hang on, or what are we going to do, really? It's sort of difficult, isn't it? Because you don't want to chase it too much, but you're thinking, well, it's a long way to go with, and only a 1-goal advantage. You don't want to sit too deep in it and it end up costing you. But obviously, it didn't matter, really, did it? Because what happened then was, one of the most famous, and, the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up as I'm talking about it now, because one of the greatest goals you'll ever see, and it's a local boy doing it. It's, what a story, really, that, he was the one that James Thomas that kept us in the league in the end.
It is one of the iconic images of our history. He picks up the ball, miles out, spots the keeper off his line and thinks, "Do you know what, I'm going to go for it." And he could not have hit him more perfectly. He just floats it so perfectly. It's in the air for an absolute age. At what point, I imagine every single Swansea fan in the stadium was just holding their breath. And you just see it drop into the net. And it's that moment when you know, yeah, everything's going to be okay. We don't need to worry about this anymore.
Yeah, I think for me it was quite a weird one. Obviously, I remember him hitting it, but from where I was in the East Stand, I actually thought it was going over. I didn't realise it was going to go in. I remember having the same conversation with Matt, and he was in the centre stand, and he actually thought it was going wide. He could tell it was going to drop like in if it was like on target. So we had sort of different views of it, if you know what I mean. But then when I remember where it was one of the best feelings like I've ever had. Like honestly, unbelievable when that hit the net. Just the sheer relief, I think, just came out for everybody. You're thinking, well, we're 2 up now. Surely we're going to be all right. And obviously that that proved to be the case then, didn't it? And we had one of the all-time, I think, great Vetch pitch invasions that were, let's be honest, they were quite legendary, weren't they? Back in the day.
If you're gonna have, if you are a connoisseur of pitch invasions, I mean, the Vetch is the place to go. I mean, we love the good pitch invasions. That's something that's changed since going to the Liberty as well. We had them in the first few years in the Liberty, but they've, I can't remember the last time we had a pitch invasion at the Liberty. Probably going back to the playoff semi-final. That's something the Vetch definitely did very, very well. That just swarm of fans engulfing the pitch, coming from all directions. Players didn't stand a chance, really. They were always going to be swept up in it.
That's what's quite funny about it, because the Vetch, obviously, the tunnel wasn't by the halfway line, is it? Like, obviously, in all the new grounds it is. I don't know at most grounds in general there always was, but it wasn't at the Vetch. So remember that you had the problem then was for, like the likes of, because we were attacking the East Stand end. Yeah. Obviously, the majority of the Swans players are in the other half, and they didn't. A lot of them, because they were new, didn't realise what was coming. So remember Leon getting absolutely swamped, and I think he had his shirt nicked, he had his boots nicked, his shin pads, the lot, because they just didn't realise what was going to happen, kind of thing. But yeah, they were, like as you say. I mean, the Forest game in the playoffs was the last time we had one. I know a lot of people don't like pitch invasion. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, but for me, it's like some of the most iconic images in football are pitch invasions. And when they're done in the right way, they're absolutely brilliant, I think.
And they always were at the Vetch as well. I can't ever remember a pitch invasion where it actually did. You'd always have a few idiots that would go over to the away fans or something and try and, get a reaction. But my memories are always of fans going on and just celebrating and, climbing goalposts, going over to the centre stand. Those are my memories of pitch invasions. I may just be looking through rose-tinted glass.
Just forgetting that Rushden and Diamonds one, that's all.
Apart from that one, which is obviously a different kind of pitch invasion. But I mean, it is what, and there's some great images from that day of the celebrations, etc. But there will always be this issue with that day of what if things had gone differently? What if Hull had scored that third goal? What if we hadn't had that penalty? What if we an infinite number of what ifs on that day. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about really what could have happened to the club, because it's not as if we were still in an amazing financial position at that point. We were still getting over, that period of difficulty. We a lot of those players were on loan to the club, and we weren't going to be likely to keep them if we were to go down. It's, if this club had become a non-league club, there is a very real risk like many others before us, and since then we would not have come back.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, there's no two ways about it. I think that summer as well, apart from Andrew Mumford, every player was like on a 1-year contract. So, I mean, everyone would have gone back, and then obviously there's like the loan players that we had as well. I mean, they wouldn't have wanted to come to us if we were in non-league, would they? So would Brian Flynn have stayed? Arguably, you'd have to say he'd be the man who'd taken us down. So maybe not. And then who honestly knows, isn't it? You are talking about a completely different club. I mean, would we have had the Liberty Stadium then? Probably not, is another thing, or certainly not at the time that we did have it. So, yeah, I think we just have to look back at it and go, thank God that, the worst didn't happen and we got away with it. And obviously we made the most, didn't we, of the opportunity we were then given afterwards, really, with what was to come. But it will always be an interesting question in terms of what would have happened, but thank God we'll never know the honest answer.
Yeah, I mean, you look at a club like Wrexham, who at that point was streets ahead of us. I mean, they were doing so much better than the Swans at that point. I mean, they were just a much. I mean, we were in the same league, but they were a much more kind of stable club. They were looking upwards. They were, just a club that we envied, really. And they've dropped out of the league, something that their fans probably never thought would happen. And they've never come back. I mean, and they're probably further away from it now than they've been at any point since relegation. And you look at other established Football League teams who've gone out of the Football League and never come back. York have gone down again. There are a club like Darlington who went out of business entirely. There are so many clubs who've just gone out the league and they've not survived and they've not come back. And I don't know who. I mean, I think we can say with a great deal of certainty that if we had dropped out of the league, then all of the great years we've had since then, climbing up to the Premier League and Europe, etc., I think we can write those off. They would not have happened. It was the defining moment in Swansea's modern history, possibly in our history, full stop.
Yeah, I think it is. It really is the ultimate sliding doors moment, isn't it? Because, with that one result would have changed the course of history unrecognisably. And like I said, where we'd be now is we'll never know. But like I said, there's no way we'd have made the Premier League, I wouldn't have thought. And, would we even be in the league now? Would we have got back? We will never know. You just think of some of those, like Leon, where would he be now? He probably wouldn't be here. Tate probably would never have come permanently. Lee Trundle, who we will talk about next time, obviously, would he have come here? I wouldn't have thought so. The ultimate messiah of the next period in our history. You just think all these things, and they wouldn't have happened. So it is without doubt the ultimate, the biggest moment in our history, and the turning point, isn't it? There's no two ways about it.
It is just fascinating. Clubs have these moments in their history where it either goes one way or the other. There are some games that just only come around once in a history, and they can end up defining a club. And that was one. That was ours. There's no doubt about that. Sometimes it goes for you. I mean, in Wrexham's case, their defining moment didn't end up changing anything, and they've gone the wrong way. This club would be a very, very different club today if things had gone differently. It was an amazing day of celebration to end two very difficult years for the Swans, tumultuous years off the pitch, very, very difficult years on the pitch. I mean, but it did set up a brighter future. But I mean, we've got a lot of things happened after that. We've got to take a step back now and look back to that takeover from Tony Petty, the businessman who took over. They received so much praise in the years after that for keeping the Swans up the following season and then building on it and getting us up through the divisions to the Premier League, into Europe, etc. I mean, they were absolute heroes. They have since, of course, lost a bit of their shine because of the way the club was sold behind the supporters' trust back to people who I think many fans were apprehensive about from the very beginning. It seems without doing the due diligence. That has certainly blotted their record. But to what extent, Steve? Because there are some fans still who will say, oh, what they did in taking the club off Petty and the activities of 2001, 2002, it's been rendered kind of it's been devalued to such an extent that it doesn't really count anymore because of the way they sold the club. Do you agree with that line of thinking?
It's definitely not been devalued to that point, does it? I mean, have they tarnished their legacy? Then there's no doubt whatsoever that they have. But before I go on to that, the fact is we are talking about local businessmen. I'd probably say we don't know what their finances were like, but with the exception of Martin Morgan, I would probably say most of them were not particularly wealthy people. So to put in 50 grand was probably quite a big deal. And we've all got to remember that there was no guarantee whatsoever that was going to come back. Hardly anyone makes money out of football, do they? So, they'll always deserve their respect for that. And obviously what came next was quite unbelievable, really. I mean, the stuff of dreams. But at the same time, have they tarnished it? Yes, because when it did get to a certain level, I think the priority stopped from being the football club to being how much money they could make off it. And okay, fair enough. As I've said before, we'd all be tempted by this life-changing money. Let's not beat around the bush with that. But they didn't have to sell it to people, basically the first serious offer, which I think is what they did, because they panicked that we'd go down and they wouldn't get as much money for it. And they tarnished us, because now look at the position that we're in. I mean, we know the finances of the club are not good and all this type of thing, and it's not going to be fixed quickly. And they are, to a large extent, responsible for it. Jenkins, because he made the decisions. And obviously, in terms of they sold to these no-hopers, as far as I'm concerned. So have they tarnished it? Yes. I mean, before we discussed it on air, I mean, like I'd liken Jenkins in some way to a bit like Arsene Wenger. Was a bit of a genius to start with, did brilliantly, but then lost it. And not only lost it, refused to admit he'd lost it and wouldn't leave. So that was like his issue, really. And it does feel a bit like that. Obviously they hung on a few of them at the end, were still taking money off us and all this kind of thing. It just, they have tarnished it. There's no two ways about it. But obviously in general, they have done far more good than bad. But, it does hurt what they've done at the end. There's no two ways about it. And, as far as I'm concerned, are they welcome? I don't know if they are at this moment in time, to be honest with you. And how their legacy is damaged, as I've said too. How damaged, I suppose time will tell, because of what happens next. I mean, if we get stuck with these guys for years and we end up dropping further down the divisions, then arguably it really is tarnished. If we get away with it and someone else comes in who's better and things stabilise off the pitch and we stay at this level, then maybe their legacy isn't so damaged. But like I say, it's time will tell, really. I mean, is that how you see it?
Yeah, I've said all along, I think history will judge them kindly on the whole. I think, they've got this tarnished record because of the sale and the way it happened, which, everybody knows was totally wrong. There were aspects of it which were immoral. There was certainly lacking in business ethics, and they let fans down in the way they sold the club. I think if many of them, if they are honest, would admit that they didn't do things the way they should have, and they did let us down. And they've got the money from that sale, and they've got to live with the consequences now, because then they're no longer welcome, most of them at games, and that for people who are in many cases lifelong fans, that's going to hurt for them. That is going to hurt. But I think if you look at everything in its totality, measuring the good against the bad, I think the good outweighs the bad massively. Like you said, they put in huge amounts of money, taking big financial risks with absolutely zero guarantee that it would pay off. I mean, the odds were against them, really, when you look at the state the club was in at that time, and they still took that plunge, they took that gamble, and rescued a club which was on its knees, and then gave us all the best times we've ever had watching football. I mean, they achieved great things. They let themselves down in the end. There's no doubt about that. But if we're measuring up the good against the bad, there's no doubt that the good massively outweighs the bad. And I think eventually we will remember them that way. When the last of the water goes under the bridge, when we kind of leave enough time, they say time is a great healer, time will heal a lot of what's gone on. I think a lot of people will be more forgiving later down the line, and I think we will be able to look back at this and say, it was very, very unfortunate the way it ended. It shouldn't have ended that way. But look at what was achieved before that. And it all started with that extremely brave and really admirable takeover by people who are willing to put their hands in their own pockets, put large amounts of money on the table to rescue a club which is so important to so many people. And for that, I think all Swansea City fans should actually be very, very grateful towards them. Whatever their opinions on the takeover that happened a few years back, we should all be very, very grateful for what happened all those years back, nearly 20 years ago now, which I don't know about you, Steve, it makes me feel very, very old.
Yeah, it does. There's no two ways about it. But I mean, I'll be honest. I mean, we've discussed these. Obviously, we did the Hollands era. Now we've done this one. But if I'm honest with you, I feel like those years make me so much more grateful for what we then saw afterwards. Because I mean, the first tournament I watched, as an example, was Euro '96, and I've got friends who were English who I was in university with and stuff, and like that's their first tournament as well. And obviously they remember England being good, for example, and then obviously after that they never did as well until the last World Cup where they also made the semi-finals. So I mean, from my point of view, you're so much more grateful if you end up doing crap and then you end up being like very good, because you know what it's like to be bad. Whereas I think if it's the other way around, you start good and then things aren't so good, you don't really appreciate being good, and you probably just resent the fact that you're not very good anymore. So, it's probably the same with Wales in some ways, isn't it? Obviously, we never had any success, and then we finally get to a tournament, and, we were one of the stories of the tournament, really making the semi-finals, isn't it? So, I certainly think that, maybe the more modern fan would probably learn a lot maybe from what we went through as when we were both younger, and, we didn't see the good times as such, and then, it does make them so much more satisfying for me when that you do end up getting them then.
Yeah, it's like anything, isn't it? If you've been through bad times, the good times taste so much better. And, when you think of the playoff final in Wembley, the European trips, the big scalps that we were accomplishing in the Premier League, so many of us who were there for those moments were also, we're having to watch the club go through those difficult times, and it does then make it gives you that greater appreciation. When even now when we're in the Championship, it gives you that greater deal of context. It gives you that understanding. Do you know what? This isn't our natural position in the Championship. This isn't, where, the Swans are just destined to be. We've been through times where we were actually struggling for our Football League survival and even our survival full stop. And when you go through something like that, it does make you appreciate then even, what would probably class as a pretty meh season this year. It's been, a bit up and down, but nothing spectacular really. But it does just give you that greater appreciation of even these kind of seasons, in the Championship. It's whatever Liverpool fans enjoy winning the Premier League when they eventually do win the Champions League, when Man United fans were on top, when Arsenal were on top, Chelsea fans, they must have had a great time, don't get me wrong. But there's nothing quite, they would not have really known what genuine adversity is. Maybe Chelsea fans would have known that if they go back long enough. But they don't know what genuine adversity is and genuine struggle is. And when you've been through that, any kind of success is just, it tastes so much sweeter. Steve, we're going to go on now in the next podcast to look at what happened afterwards. it's going to be plain sailing from now on. It's going to be fantastic memories. It's going to be trundle. It's going to be promotions. It's going to be beautiful football. It's going to be moving to a new stadium. It's going to be all this success. But put simply, it would not have been possible without the work that was done in that 2002-2003 season, would it?
No, it wouldn't. And as you say, we did benefit a lot then from what was to come. And I think the next few podcasts are going to be, looking back at a more enjoyable time and, far more enjoyable memories really than what we have been discussing. So yeah, I must admit I'm quite looking forward to that.
I absolutely cannot wait. I'll be honest to you. This we are about to embark on a golden era in Swansea City's history, and it all began really with that famous day against Hull. Next time round, we're going to be discussing Lee Trundle, Andy Robinson, the arrival of Kenny Jackett, FA Cup scalps, and the start of Swansea's climb through the divisions, really. I really am looking forward to that because it was a fantastic time to be a Swansea City fan. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast, even though the subject matter has not been as positive, as enjoyable, but it's still fascinating, really, looking back at that time. If you've got any kind of thoughts, leave them in the comments below or respond to us on Twitter. But until next time, stay safe and we'll see you then.